letter C is interesting. I think that students are so convinced that everybody was a slave owner back in the day that they don't really have a hard time understanding what letter C is saying. It begins by saying that every member of the Virginia delegation owned slaves, but the Virginia delegation was just one of 13 delegations. There were 12 other states or colonies represented. So what I want to focus on is the number where David McCullough says that, you know, as far as we know, around 1/3 of the signers of the Declaration owned or had owned slaves. So I can't remember exactly. I think it's 55 or so signers of the Declaration. So then it comes out to something like 18 or so members of the Continental Congress who signed it owned or had owned slaves. So think about the math here. I put this up on the board, that the number of signers who owned or had owned slaves, as far as we know, were 1/3. It says at least, because we're not sure if there were any more than that. As far as all the documentary evidence goes, we know of 1/3. But then if you want to know how many actually owned slaves at the time of signing the Declaration, you'd have to subtract from 1/3 the number who had owned slaves, because they didn't own slaves at the time of signing the Declaration. So you're talking about less than 1/3, less than 18 of the signers of the Declaration owned slaves at the time of signing the Declaration. I think this excuses most of the signers of the Declaration from the accusation of hypocrisy. How can you, this is a charge that's leveled against them, how could they have signed a document that talks about all men being created equal and be slave owners at the same time and actually have African Americans in mind? Well, the fact is that the great majority, the vast majority of the signers of the Declaration were not slave owners. And this, I think, is greatly misunderstood. When you get to letter D and focus on Jefferson, I want you to, again, to see that when, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, it was illegal to free your slaves. Slave owners could not free their slaves in the state of Virginia. So if Jefferson was born owning slaves as part of inheritance from his father, if when he married, his wife owned slaves, so he came to be a slave owner, he was not free to free his slaves. It was not legal to free his slaves. If there was one slave that did something really wonderful, like saved somebody's life, he could petition the legislature of Virginia, and if the Virginia legislature and the governor agreed, then you could set free that slave. But just setting free slaves was not something that was legal. So again, you can't fault people for not freeing their slaves if it was not possible to do so. What Jefferson did do, you can see in letter D, is one of the first things he tried to do when he entered the legislature of Virginia was to try to change that, was to try to make it easier, at least, for owners to free their slaves. He was virtually alone in wanting to do this. He did not get support from his fellow legislators, so the law did not change at the time. You can also see that after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, again, Jefferson attempted to provide for the gradual abolition of slavery in the Constitution, but that again was not received by his fellow Virginians. Jefferson is open to the accusation that later in his life, at the end of his life, when it was legal to free slaves, when the laws had changed, he failed to do that, and I think that is a flaw in Jefferson. I think Jefferson was somebody whose finances were not in the best order, and he failed to live up to his own convictions. So I would agree that that's unfortunate that he didn't live up to his ideals.